Today we're stepping into the Gospel of Luke for another encounter with the risen Lord, this time on the road to Emmaus. Luke's Gospel begins with a journey. Mary and Joseph journeyed to Bethlehem, where Mary gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger. And now at the end of the Gospel, this story of the two others on the road. When the boy Jesus is 12, his parents journeyed with him to Jerusalem for the Passover. But the child is lost there. But on the third day, he is found. So Luke's gospel signals from the very beginning that the wood of the manger becomes the wood of the cross. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Right in the middle of Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verse 51, we read, "When the day drew near for him to be taken up, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem." Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem for 10 chapters in Luke's Gospel. In chapter 10, Jesus tells the story of a man coming down the road from Jerusalem, down the mountain path. It's a very steep and treacherous path, coming down the road to Jericho. And he's set upon by robbers and left for dead by the side of the road. A Samaritan came along and stopped and tended to his wounds. At the bottom of that road in Jericho, the lowest city on the face of the earth, there is a blind man sitting beside the road. Jesus calls him to himself, and then he restores his sight. When the eyes of the blind man were opened, he too followed Jesus on the road. Now we have a story of two disciples who are going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Their eyes were kept from recognizing Jesus because they're going the wrong way. They are walking away from Jerusalem. But here's the good news. Jesus walks with them. The resurrected Jesus seeks out his two errant disciples, joining them even as they walk in the wrong direction and talk about him in all the wrong ways. As he quietly, unobtrusively slipped into the waters of the Jordan to stand next to sinners, and as he willingly suffered alongside two other crucified criminals, so here, without fanfare, Jesus falls into step with the two who are on their way. In the Gospel of Luke, whenever there are lost sheep, lost sons, or lost coins, someone goes in search of them. So we are not surprised that the Messiah has walked all the way with them, just as he has accompanied sinful humanity all the way to the limit of sin and death. As always, the Bible tells the story not so much of our quest for God, but God's passionate search for us. A young student once came to Rabbi Abraham Heschel complaining of religious confusion and doubts about God's existence. The young man had grown up in a family that was full of faith. He attended the synagogue regularly, read the scriptures daily, and had been quite pious. But now, as a university student, his religious life had dissipated considerably, and he was beset with every kind of doubt. He shared with Rabbi Heschel his pain about these doubts and how he could no longer find the God of his youth in his present situation. Rabbi Heschel asked him, "And what makes you think that God wanted your former peace, but does not want your present pain?" Cleopas and his companion are sad because they too cannot find the risen Lord in their present situation. That's because the disciples did not learn the lesson from the Garden of Gethsemane because they could not stay awake and pray with Jesus. They fell asleep, Luke tells us, out of sadness, despair. Wasn't it necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things? Was the lesson they didn't learn in Gethsemane. They never made the connection. And so they hadn't understood earlier when Jesus had said the same thing to the older brother about the prodigal son. Wasn't it necessary that we should celebrate because this brother of yours was dead and now is alive? Isn't it necessary that a God who is love beyond all measure and understanding should give himself over freely? And isn't it necessary that if you give yourself over freely and mean it, that you too will have to sweat blood in a garden? There was something about the way that Jesus opened the Scriptures for the two disciples that spoke deeply to their heart. And so, although Jesus walked ahead as if he were going on, they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So Jesus went in to stay with them. And when he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. At the end of the story, two friends of God sit down with Jesus to eat what God offers to them in love, thereby undoing the anxious grasping of the meal described at the very beginning of the story. After the graceless meal of Eden, the eyes of Adam and Eve were opened, and they saw themselves as threatened, vulnerable, and alienated from God. After the graceful feast of Emmaus, the eyes of Cleopas and his companion are opened, and they recognize the divine self-gift of God made flesh. But the story doesn't end here. There's a postscript. That same hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem. So the gospel began with movement in the wrong direction, but now they're going in the right direction. And they find the 11 and their companions gathered together. Christianity is always about communion. It's always a companion journey. We never walk alone. This week, Pope Francis gave a TED Talk. I hope you had a chance to watch it. He made a similar point. He said, the only future worth building includes everyone. Reflecting on the story of the Good Samaritan, the Pope said, all it takes is for one person to stop and help. A single individual is enough for hope to exist. And that individual can be you. And then there'll be another you, and another you. And it turns into an us. And so the Pope asked, does hope begin when we have an us? No, he said. Hope began with one you. When there is an us, there begins a revolution.